Hello, everyone. Welcome to part two of the NCME Classroom Assessments Committee's webinar on equity and assessment for learning. We are so happy to see everyone again, and those for the first time. If you could, just like last time, we'd be happy if you just turned on your video and said hello to all of us. And then in the chat, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself. So your name, position, institution, current location in the world, and what you do for work. Hello, everyone. Good to see you. I'm going to put in mine as well. So all of this information, name, location, what you do for work. This is me.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We're so excited for a fabulous conversation.
Hi, Emma. one of my cohorts in the doctoral program at Washington State University. Hello. Hi, everyone. All over the US so far. Hey, Carla.
Hi, Chad. Hi, Carla. So are we allowed?
So Jade right now is in the Chicago airport, so we hear some some folks behind. I'll be there later on today.
Curious if anybody else is going to Korea here. Raise your hand in the Zoom if you're going to Korea.
Culturally responsive evaluation and assessment is what that is. Fantastic. It is so good to see everybody and to meet many new people. All right, I suppose we can do this orally as well. So my name is Dustin Van Orman. I'm the co-chair of the NCME Classroom Assessment Committee and a STEM Education Research Associate at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. I've been an educator for about 14 years and in a variety of levels and topics. And my research work focuses on identifying effective, equitable, student-centered instruction and assessment in STEM higher education and in K-12 education.
Thanks, Dustin. And my name is Jade Cainsley. I am the co-chair of the NCME Classroom Assessment Committee with Dustin. I'm also an assistant research professor at the University of Kansas, where I lead the equity and assessment area within the Achievement and Assessment Institute's Center for Learner Agency, Research, and Action. I also run my own educational consulting firm called the JC Research Group. Okay, Renee.
I'm talking, but I was muted. Good morning or good afternoon, all. My name is Kay Renee Pullen. I am a member of the NCME Classroom Assessment Committee, and I'm an elementary science specialist for Caddo Parish Public Schools. In my role, I support teachers within science instruction and assessment in the classroom, and then I support leaders as they support our teachers. And so I've been an educator for about 25 years now, and I had 16 years in the classroom. Really excited to learn with you all today.
It's going to be good. So
Yeah.
this webinar series was organized by the NCME Classroom Assessment Committee. We're a group of professionals working in K-12 schools and district contexts, teacher education, research, and evaluation. And we have a shared interest in making equitable and high quality practice of classroom assessment mainstream and well understood. We also work to spur and communicate classroom assessment scholarship within and beyond the National Council on Measurement and Education's networks.
So today's webinar is the second part of a two-part conversation about equity and how formative assessments can have a profound impact on how students approach learning. We have some stellar speakers on our panel today, and we're just really thrilled that they're sharing their wealth of expertise with us. And so we really encourage you to participate in the discussions in the chat. Jade has it going on in there, I promise you. So please share your own experiences and your ideas in the chat. And finally, I want to get a little note in, we'll say it again later, that I want to let you all know that in the fall of 2024, we will have a classroom assessment conference. So please keep an eye out for a call for proposals, which should come out in the spring of 2024.
Yes, thank you so much, Kay Renee. Also, we want to just quickly recap our fabulous part one of this webinar series. Dr. Erin Marie Furtak and Dr. Kosun Kang did a fabulous job setting us up with giving us some information around how they conceptualize theoretically equity in the context of assessment for learning. They shared some of their journeys in terms of how they came to understand assessment for learning in an equitable context from their experiences as classroom practitioners. And they also problematize some of the things that currently happen in classrooms, especially for folks who are working in spaces where they might see some inequitable practices. We will share the video recording link later, and this webinar will also be recorded and sent out at a later date. So thank you so much for having us with you. And if you want to see part one, you definitely should, because it set us up and teed us up. I see a lot of attorneys here from part one, so it's great to see y'all. And we're looking forward to a fabulous conversation.
Well, with that, let's start the conversation. So I'd like to let panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work and also about how their work intersects with assessment and equity. So maybe we can kick this one off to Megan. Hi, I see you down there on the bottom of my screen.
Bonjour everyone, thanks for having me. My name's Megan. I'm a professor of the learning sciences at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. And I'll have lots more to say, but I come to this conversation actually, to be honest, I'll say I started this conversation and have come back as a scholar to it. I started as a preschool teacher, and then I taught GED. I taught in alternative settings for recently released juvenile offenders. And all of the assessments that I was required to use as an educator did nothing to help me do my work in better ways. And I have to be honest, for a long time, I just sort of ignored it afterwards. And then as a scholar, I've come back to really recognize how is it that we build assessments that actually help educators be better educators and help us see the potentially really powerful things in kids and families' lives that could be leading and contributing to academic excellence that we have no ways of helping educators learn to see now. So I'll leave it for there now, and I'll have lots more to say about that. So thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. All right, so Elena, you're up.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. My name is Elena Diaz-Balalo, and I'm with the Center for Assessment, Design, Research, and Evaluation. We're a small center. We're located in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. And just in a kind of high-level nutshell, a lot of the work that I do is to undertake kind of research evaluation work with school, district, and state partners. And a lot of this work is about focusing on the dynamics of classroom activities happening to support, for example, educational initiatives or instructional models that are taking place, such as project-based learning. I think it's fair to say that all of this work is being done to really figure out ways or find ways to strengthen the learning environment, to kind of strengthen the learning experiences for students. So it's not just about, it's important to deepen these disciplinary understandings, but it's really to facilitate this feeling of belongingness, inclusion for students so that they can better participate in these classroom activities. So, yeah.
It is so wonderful to have you both here. And unfortunately, our third panelist couldn't make it today, but we, last minute, asked her to record some videos. Actually, she volunteered to record some videos. And so I'm going to share with you throughout our talk today, a couple videos and answers to some of the questions that we prepared. So I'll go ahead and do that now and let her introduce herself. Can everyone see my screen? I don't have the little green thing. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sorry I'm unable to join live. My name is Alisa Cavazos, and I'm currently the director for the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I am also an associate professor in the Department of Writing and Language Studies at the University of Texas, Rio Grande.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Technology is great when it works.
Oh, no, come on.
Of Texas, Rio Grande.
No. Oh, okay.
If you fast forward past that part, perhaps it would unbuffer.
It's not going to work.
That's okay. We tried our best.
I will try to, instead of playing her videos, here, let's stop share. Instead of playing her videos, I'll try to bring in some of her perspectives as we talk with Elena and Megan throughout this conversation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with a conversation around equity and assessment for learning. So like I said, we prepared a couple questions and shared them in advance with the panelists, but we haven't actually met each other to practice any of this. And so this is all off of our off the cuff, and we're willing to engage in a really organic conversation. So please do share in the chat what you're thinking, some questions that you have, and we can use those questions to keep the conversation going. So the first question I have for everybody, for Megan and for Elena, is around the first part. So in the first part of the series, Aaron and Hosan talked about their personal journeys around equity and assessment for learning. So how has your journey unfolded, and what were some of the aha moments for you and the people that you've for you or for the people that you've interacted with around assessment for learning and equity? We'll kick this one to Megan first, maybe.
I decided which part of this personal journey that I would share, because you're going to notice I have a theme that I wanted to share today. Honestly, the reason I came back to really thinking about personal assessments is when my own children entered school, who were thriving at home, and they went to school and immediately became assessed in ways that said they were behind in everything. And that it was like a really personally complicated time around like, wait, upon immediate entrance into school, all of these assessment measures were creating new pathways for my kids and mediating a relationship with my kids' teachers in a way that I knew enough. I mean, I was a professor by then, but the teachers assumed that I was illiterate and that me and my husband were illiterate 3 times in a row, 6 years in a row. Kids into kindergarten, all of their teachers assumed that we were illiterate. They assumed that we were poor, and they like it was so fast. And partly what was happening is that our kids were very quiet in class and weren't engaging in a set of school-based behaviors. And like my kids were reading and writing by kindergarten, but they weren't doing it in the classroom at all. They were completely clammed up. And so for me, I have to be honest, I think that I had jumped classes enough and thought, you know, these kids have 2 graduate degree parents, that like they would be adaptive enough in entering the school that we didn't have to worry about it. But the difference between who they were at home and who they felt safe to be at school was so startling. And it made me really push to say like, okay, I gotta help figure this out, because if this is happening for us, no wonder it's happening at scale in these sorts of ways. So I'll say that, and then I'll say that as a teacher educator, the other major aha moment for me when I was an early teacher educator is that I would get lots of educators saying, of course I want to be a culturally responsive educator. Of course I don't want to be reifying all kinds of deficit normative assumptions. Right. As a teacher educator, I work pretty hard to make it very clear that there's a way in which school systems have routinized that poor folks and parents of color don't raise kids that are successful in school. Right. It is a kind of normalized, unreported kind of thing. But what I would get from teachers a lot of time is, no, I don't believe in any of that ideologically. But I have kids from 15 different cultural communities who speak 12 different languages. I can't possibly actually be a culturally responsive educator. I don't know that much about. So I got lots of like, okay, but the wealth of expertise I'm supposed to have about cross-cultural communities is too big a teacher demand. And for me, what became really clear is we didn't have tools to help educators be the kind of teachers they wanted to be. Instead, what they felt like is they were getting assessments that really pushed them to move in directions that were not about improved learning. It was actually about a kind of systems fulfillment that was actually demotivating to them over time too. So for me, the aha moment was like, oh, wait, what are the assessment tools that we need that can anticipate the challenges of transforming and creating equitable educational systems in ways that don't get mobilized towards punitive ends for educators and/or kids and families? So those two touch points were pretty big for me and have remained.
And maybe this is a good opportunity to share Elisa Cavazos, her perspectives on this. She, very similarly to you, Megan, talked about how very early on as a student herself, not talking about her own kids, but as a student herself, she had a parent-teacher conference, and her mother asked, why is my daughter failing your class? And the teacher responded, well, she's learning English as a first language. What do you expect? Of course, she's not going to get an A in English. And so her mother said, well, why would you even expect that? These kids have been speaking English since preschool, and she's just starting out. And you all saw at least a snippet of it. She speaks English, I mean, as well as any of us, right? And so it was just the teacher coming at that perspective of Elisa as from the deficit, right? That was in her mind the best she could do inside of that situation. And so that was the aha moment for Elisa. And I'm curious about yours now, Elena. What was yours? The question's so far away. I'll go ahead and say it again. So in part one, Aaron and Hassan talked about their journey around equity and assessment for learning. So how has your journey unfolded, and what were some of the aha moments for you and/or the people that you've interacted with?
Yeah, so I'm coming into this conversation from a very different space from, I would say, the other panelists. And just to kind of frame this a little bit, I started my career in a school district, Denver Public Schools, where I started out as a evaluator. I had probably the craziest job that I can't imagine is in place in any kind of school district, meaning that my job was a two-person team to conduct evaluations of program initiatives, educational opportunities that were happening across the entire school district. We had a docket of about 8 to 10 evaluations that we needed to fulfill in any given year. And what this ended up doing was I had the opportunity to not only enter a lot of different classroom spaces, meaning that so much of this work was understanding how classroom practices were being taken up to, say, implement certain initiatives, but also it intersected with so many different areas, including transportation, issues of school choice, issues of finance, issues of textbook adoptions. All of these areas, I think, just gave me a broader appreciation for the larger infrastructure that supports this entire enterprise of education. And I just want to say here that, I think that work allowed me to interact with a lot of amazing, well-intentioned people. But I think many of you all who work in school districts, I see some of my friends here, know that this work, particularly in a large urban school district, is incredibly messy, incredibly complex. There's so many competing interests, a lot of pressures from the public as well as from within, priorities. There's only so much resources that can go around. And one thing you quickly learn is how easy it is for the adults in the system to really lose sight of the students. And it's, I think something that many of us, we get anguished because we recognize that, and it's part of our reflective journey, but you realize you're in this constant hamster wheel to do so much work to fulfill a lot of the pressures from the larger policy landscape as well, that it becomes really hard to remember that what you're doing is really in service of the students. And we need to rethink the ways perhaps we do some of the work, the district work. I also, another, I would say, part of my learning journey is having had the opportunity when I was a student at the School of Education. I took a youth development course. It was really integral for me. It was really important for me as part of that learning journey to take not just curriculum courses as well, to really complement the courses that I was taking under, say, the research evaluation methodology program, but to also understand some of the developmental issues around youth development. So I took this course where my project was to focus on understanding why students drop out of schools. What is the underlying motivation? And I think, as many of you know who has probably worked with this population, is there are many reasons for why they drop out. But I think a common thread that ran through all of these stories was this notion of, we're not being seen, we're not being heard, we're not getting help. On, for example, the assignments, several of these students had learning disabilities such as dyslexia, and they weren't getting the types of scaffolded supports or strategies needed to effectively engage or even just be able to take up their assignments. And you just realize it tells you a lot when you hear those voices about the nature of the classroom assessment experiences, or that activity system that both Erin and Hosun had talked about in their previous session. It tells you about how those structures are set up in ways that are not inclusive, that are not allowing these students to feel like they're valued contributors in the classroom spaces. So I think just hearing from the student voices, which is, I think similar to the experiences that many, such as Megan, you talked about your experience, hearing the voices from your students, from your children as well. I think all of this just tells you that there's a lot to be learned from how we shape the activities, the routines, the practices, the learning environment writ large, in order to help facilitate these types of, I would say, more equitable learning experiences for students.
I really appreciate you all sharing your perspective as educators, parents, so important. Although thinking about students saying something like we're not getting the help we need is just so heartbreaking. But we have lots of opportunities to do better for our students. And so I think that kind of goes to my next question. How does your work with equity contribute to improving assessments and the assessment process for the benefit of student learning, motivation, belongingness, or other valued outcomes? And Megan or Elena, either one, you can begin.
And if I go first this time, you get to go first next time. So we're not always in this order.
That's fair.
So I guess one of the things that I've really been spending a lot of time on in the last couple of years that I'd like to really share is, for me, this, I think that good assessment practices help create classrooms where kids feel like what they're learning matters for who they are, matters for the world outside, and is connected to their communities. So a lot of my research has been around trying to understand learning processes, and around particular, I tend to be focused on STEM disciplines, although increasingly I'm thinking about literacy all the time too, and recognizing how much, for how many learners end up feeling like they're learning things in classrooms. I personally had a student say to me once when I was a classroom teacher, which, by the way, I still teach high school students and teach PK5, co-teach with teachers. But they said to me once, I tell people this often, been teaching to a group of students, half of who were subsistence hunters, about carrying capacities in ecosystems. And at one point, a kid asked me 5 weeks into a unit if carrying capacity of an ecosystem was like a real thing. Like, could we overhunt and not have food left? And that moment has defined me as an educator, because of course I never meant to be there. I thought I was doing culturally responsive instruction, but it still meant for 5 weeks, these kiddos who had deep cultural knowledge about all the academic phenomena I was teaching them about, they lived it actually better than I did. They knew it in the way that they lived, better than any classroom, and probably most people do. Had been in like a sense of suspended animation or something about like what they were learning and whether it mattered in the world. So for me, what I've been seeing and learning about that, but what I'm after is saying, like, what are the infrastructures, that activity system that routinize educators being able to see the expertise and forms of thought that kids are routinely engaged in at home, not occasioned. And right now, we don't have activity systems that presume ongoing interaction between learners and their families around content. And a way of seeing it in that isn't only around mastery of kind of, frankly, what I would call Western form of content. So I think a lot about the heterogeneity of knowing much of the phenomena that we want kids to know. Most people in the world know something about ecosystems, for example, and I've studied cross-cultural variation and reasoning about the natural world. People the world over have been making sense of the natural world since time immemorial. But how we want kids to know it in school systems is from a particular paradigm. That doesn't mean that kids don't know things, right? That communities and families don't know things, but we don't have systems that help educators see it or support educators in mobilizing it towards generative learning. In fact, most of what we started to do was infrastructure that what kids learned at home was probably a misconception that could inhibit the kind of learning we need them to do. And for a long time, we had a system structured based in that idea. And so my work has really been about saying, like, what is a routine activity system where educators are building relationships with families and with kids' home-based knowledges towards generative learning? And why I say routinize is because I think lots of educators do the, like, tell me, I did it too. So there's not a call out of educators. It's a systems problem about how we infrastructure this. Tell me about your family. And it was like the get to know you survey in the beginning of the year. But it wasn't a built-in conversation for everything we were learning. And it wasn't set up in a way where it helped. Actually, I think one thing that we often forget is the history of relations between schools and many non-dominant communities is one of power and harm. And so the set of relations between schools and families also is like an historically accumulating problem. And if we don't have deliberate interventions of restructuring the nature of those relations, they impact those interactions, even if not intended. And I think that was another piece for me as a teacher educator is, most people become teachers because they were pretty good students. Not everyone. I'd like to see that we see that shifting. But if you were successful at navigating our system, it takes some work to remember there are very fundamental relational differences that you cannot presume. And it was pretty easy to see educators replicate pretty deficit narratives pretty quickly because of how they were reading familial participation. And so for us, this work about, like, what does it mean to set up an activity system that takes seriously the set of conditions between families and communities and schools and work to transform them in ways that think about families as places of intellectual work, places with deep resources towards the kind of school-based learning we want, meant that it needed to be routinized, not occasional. And curriculum isn't built like that. My big example is ask teachers how many times they get to actually talk to families face-to-face as part of the system structure. By high school, you get like 1 or 2 minutes with a kid's parent, right? That is a theory of relations built into our systems, right? And it's true across. And so we were after saying, what are the new forms of tools that could help? And, I recognize we already asked educators to do about 100 minutes of work in every 1 minute they actually are in interaction. So it's an absurd, we have a real problem with how much we're trying to pack into things. But for us, the assessment infrastructure was around really trying to say, could we create systems and tools that helped rebuild relations between educators and families and made these deep intellectual resources much more transparent in routine ways so that educators could build with them in interaction in their classrooms.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bang. Every time you talk, I think about what are the better ways that I can help my colleagues within my own system build those relationships and really value the different ways of knowing that our students have, the way they see the natural world, think about the phenomena that's happening right in our own local systems. Thank you so much. I would like to continue this question with Elena.
Yeah, I think a lot of the just the valuable work that Megan just articulated, I think that is really the type of work that, I think all of us could certainly benefit from understanding how to take up and do well, the connections back to families, connections back to communities. I would say my work has been more limited in this area in the sense that, it's really stayed within the classroom learning environment. And so I think there's a lot more connections that we can certainly do to strengthen that work. But having said that, I think, I've been spending about 10 plus years working with arts and physical education folks. And I did that mainly because it was really important for us to think about how do we afford kind of richer experience in these areas throughout the school district, particularly in places where they don't have, for example, access or resources to have these rich programs that are creative, that really foster connectedness. And so we did a lot of work around instructional resources, for example, with embedded performance assessments. And just so you know, we did this because we wanted to push out the uses of, say, multiple choice tests that were I would say, the standard format for evaluating students in these subject areas. There is a serious, I would say, method match problem here, particularly when thinking about these are performance rich subjects, but they would actually have people, for example, suspend a physical education course where they'd suddenly sit down on the gymnasium floor and they're filling out these bubble tests. It made no sense whatsoever. So what we were trying to do was to kind of counter that type of activity and amplify the importance of creating these types of embedded performance assessments that were so much more a natural extension and part of the instructional work that was happening and the experiences that students were having. So this work I felt was really powerful in the sense that it was all in service of kind of improving the learning and assessment experiences for both students and teachers. It was also used to provide insights for the instructional curriculum specialists that I worked with at the time, so that they can also engage with teachers in coaching and mentorship work. And I think that's really important because it's all about, again, building capacity in this infrastructure that supports a classroom activity system. And, so for some folks, they may be wondering, well, why isn't this type of mentoring happening in the schools? Well, oftentimes, the teachers in these subject areas operate as singletons. I mean, that's kind of the word that's actually used. They don't have connections to, say, professional learning communities. They don't have connections to, say, other art teachers or physical education teachers because they're the lone teacher in the school that's actually doing this type of work. And so at least the instructional specialists at the district level have found is that they can use a lot of the tools, the work that we were doing together to kind of start moving towards helping teachers kind of think about things like, what kind of discourse strategies are you using with your students? What kind of instructional moves can we do based on some of the insights we're learning from, say, the student work on for example, this particular art project, or how they engage in these types of physical education strategies. So I think that's just an example of how this type of work can be done in more richer ways to promote equitable learning opportunities in spaces that have typically not, I would say, been thought of or valued as much, particularly, I would say, during the NCLB era.
I really appreciate you acknowledging that we practitioners oftentimes lack access to professional learning and collaboration as it concerns assessments, but especially like those embedded assessments in classroom activities. I'm thinking about, what have you learned with the work that you do with your schools and the teachers and the students about the affordances and challenges with equitable assessment practices?
Yes, I promise, Megan, I'll go.
I think that kind of goes in line with what you were just saying too.
Unless Dustin, you want to share out some feedback from, okay, all right, sure. I'll talk a little bit about affordances, and this is related to a point that Megan brought up in terms of relational pieces. I know, this is an NCME crowd, but it's important for me just to emphasize this, the quality of relational interactions in terms of like the power of love. Just thinking in terms of how love is channeled between students, between teacher and students in this type of classroom activity system, it's amazing what you can get in terms of motivation. And I say this because even during, for example, the height of the pandemic and having observed so many classrooms, even one-on-one conferencing taking place between students and teachers, the one thing that I notice over and over again is that the teachers who are getting more traction with their students during this really difficult time, even when they couldn't even see them on the video screen. We had, for example, listened in on a conferencing between a teacher and a student where the student was calling from work because their parents had lost their jobs. He was also helping out with trying to bring in income, but this relationship, this trust building, this bond that he had with this teacher compelled him to continuously check in, to ask the teacher, okay, I know I'm not going to get this assignment down in this period of time, but would you be willing for me to work on it within this period of time? And just the back and forth dialogue between that student and the teacher, I mean, so much of it, you could tell this trusting relationship, but the love that was being channeled from the teacher to the student and student to teacher was amazing. You just realize how much more motivation that this particular student had in order to stay connected with his learning. And that says a lot because this type of trusting relationship really builds, I would say student agency. It really builds that desire to be motivated and stay connected to this work. So I think those are some of the affordances that happen in terms of equitable practices when it's really about the quality of relational interactions or the trust building that happens in the classroom space. I'm going to kind of shift a little bit to a challenge. And I think I alluded to this earlier. And I think a lot of people who think about systems and systems theories, we know that a lot of these structures are shaped in ways that determines behaviors, right? So I go to a lot of different spaces where I hear about student-centered, yes, we do that. Equity-centered, yes, we do that. We're committed to social justice. I mean, that's wonderful. But as many of you know, if the structures don't change, doesn't matter how many people rotate in and out, or if you get new leadership, those behaviors won't change, and you get the same inequitable experiences being reproduced, I would say, over and over again. And I only say this because, I think, again, these are well-intentioned folks who are trying to do their jobs, but oftentimes what they're working with is just unrealistic time horizons to be taking up complex work. And I hear this in many spaces where, for example, you have districts governed by what they call policy governance boards, where the superintendents they're under essentially a really high pressure timeline to deliver within a 1-year period of time sometimes. Here are some really asinine targets that you have to meet in terms of how much performance your students must demonstrate on, say, standardized assessments. And that, unfortunately, just keeps on trickling down, even though that district may have a commitment to say student-centered. These types of pressures are completely incompatible with those types of activities, which take so much time, so much work in order to do well. So this notion of doing this work well in order to go slower with this work is so critical, but cannot be compatible with what's happening oftentimes at the leadership level.
I want to tell you thank you for what you just said. I am clapping. Thank you. I am the choir. I appreciate the work that you do with districts that you work with, because you are clearly speaking from a place of experience, but also support and understanding. I truly hope you can believe me when I tell you how much I appreciate that, and how not having, just the woes of the pressures on you and the time on you. And I appreciate you calling out that challenge and the work that you're doing to support us as we work with our kids. But I want to share this similar question with Dr. Bang. What have you learned with your work with schools and students? And what are some of the affordances and challenges that you've seen as it concerns equitable assessment practices?
Yeah, thank you for everything that was just said. I'm so with you. I actually wrote like part of it is pacing expectations and a kind of linearity of the progress through teaching that I think often means that there are a series of decisions made. So I'm just on board with you. So I have a project right now that is in 52 districts across 5 different states, where we are trying to actually get what we call our family tool system routinely embedded and seeing where it's going. And I guess I'm just going to speak a little bit from this around like what does it look like to be across 5 different states and really different geographies and places in the United States with different political landscapes, different historical landscapes, and enough variety in sort of racial and cultural communities that anyone, I just am not a person that thinks you can standardize all of that, but we've been trying to come up with a model for what does some of this work look like. And I'll tell you a couple of things that's really clear. That is one, this piece about pacing. One of the things that we work with a lot on is going slow to move super fast later is very hard. People don't believe that, right? And then there are all these systems pressures. And I think that we work pretty hard to say, no, all the time. And in my experience, until an educator sees it and experiences it, it's almost like there's 6 months of high skepticism. And then when it works, it's like paradigm shift. It's like a systems change perspective that you can see in educators. And I think that really matters. But I also think that there are deeper layers that you need time to be able to see. So I think we work with most educators who opt into our work already have a particular kind of equity orientation, frankly, or else you probably wouldn't want to hang out with me in the first place. But I think it takes a little while for people to realize the layers of which we've been trained to presume deficit or not see strength in kids' reasoning, and or not be able to see that academic language isn't the same as idea, and to start to see the brilliance of ideas in everyday language, and be able to do the work of mapping between what we might see as brilliant intellectual work in community settings alongside and connected to the academic work of schooling. That takes practice. And that as a skill needs practice and it needs reinforcement. So that has been a huge one. I think the other thing for us is that the longer term relationships between families and communities, I think people underestimate that. I work in lots of communities who are multi-generational in the same place. I had a grandma once say to me, I bring my kid to the classroom that I used to experience corporal punishment in, or I bring my grandchild to. Most educators and most middle-class people in the United States are fairly mobile. And that if you're in a system that's rapidly changing, even if you're a teacher that teaches in the same community, the school system has changed and the level of detail that you're engaged in is often very different than what families have experienced. And so for us to get educators kind of attuned to the relational conditions and realize that they're historical actors in a community, not that the family is supposed to act on the school's terms, is a big paradigm shift. Because often educators, even though educators are disempowered in all kinds of ways, often underestimate their power over families. And getting educators to be attuned to that, even though they're disempowered by all these other kind of power paradigms, leaders too, like really making sense of what it means to be an historical actor and recognizing the multiplicity of power that we all operate in is a lot to hold, right? And so we often talk about how do you get educators to start seeing their sphere of influence, and what power they can enact and in what ways. And that takes a little bit of time too. I think the thing that and this is what you're getting at before, I think what is hard and I ethically feel complicated about is educators starting to see the deep brilliance of children and starting to realize that the systems that ask them to assess them in particular ways sometimes do harm to them, right? The tension of like, what am I accountable to? And if I start to see how harmful it is, like, what does it mean to be an actor in a system that is replicating harm and continue to do the work of expanding it? And I think that ebb and flow is a real one that we don't know enough about, I would argue, as a field, about like what happens when you have these really dynamic, transformative educators, and how do you create schools and communities where people can both continue to push but don't get what Danny Martin calls an unrealistic solution on demand paradigm that sets people up for being disheartened, being tired, being burnt out, being unable to move. And at the same time, I recently sort of got schooled by an elder of mine that said, we have a long way to go, but don't keep thinking that it's going to take us a long time to get where we need to go. Like, what does it mean to also refuse the idea that systems have to move slowly? And I would argue the biggest gift of COVID was teaching us that actually we can move pretty dang fast when we need to. It's actually a little bit about political will and a clarity of what needs to happen. And so the last thing I guess I'll just say about this is, we, our project started before COVID, and then COVID happened. And the project that I'm talking about in 5 states is really trying to engage in field-based STEM education, interdisciplinary STEM education. And you can't be advocating for place-based education via Zoom. That's not the place-based I was after in this project. So what we did is we actually partnered with families to create family tools and support families in doing science learning. And I'm raising this because what was interesting about it is that it also taught us that doing the work of transforming familial perceptions of what is possible to the kinds of possible relationships with schools was much harder than just having right intentions or even good tools, right? That lots of families were like, okay, you 3 are cool, but that doesn't mean that I'm now good with the system. And I'm just raising that as an ongoing thing because for me, these are interconnected around this demand for time, right? We set up educational leaders to have to do something, but we also set up families to move at scales of change that are complicated if we really think about the layers of potential relational repair we need to do. And I often say, like, rightful distrust of school systems is historically informed. It might be irrational. I'm a Native woman. It would be irrational for me to presume that a system has my best interest at heart. So I'll stop there.
Drop the mic there.
Yeah, that's it. I think, so much of what you both shared, I think everybody in this Zoom room can pause for a second and just feel the chills of how big this issue is. It is, like we've talked about, a system, and it's all over the place and reified in different ways across different jurisdictions. And, what happens in the classroom, a teacher could have all students' best interests in mind and a really great idea about how to support students' sense of agency, their own cultural linguistic assets. But the system itself can be flawed in such a way that the pressure forces a teacher to work in a certain direction, right, towards testing or towards a specific curriculum that they're given. We don't have Elisa Cavazos here, but the perspective that she shared inside of the video was around what a teacher could do. She didn't go so far to think about all of these systematic issues, but I think we'll still need to continue going down that line of thinking. But Elisa Cavazos was talking about one particular task that someone could do instead of, for instance, assigning an essay that a student writes for a specific topic. They could do a writer's memo first and talk about what it is that they want to write about, to talk about what kind of feedback they'd like on it, to talk about how they understand the criteria in which they're being assessed, or to co-construct that criteria first and then to write it within the memo. And so her thinking was around, how do we build students' agency, all of the diverse people that come into school spaces, to really be able to shine in how brightly they are, right? And not have to be forced into a mold of which all students need to be. So I wish she was here. She'd be more articulate than me, but I think we should continue this conversation. And the next one, I think, is a big one, and I think one that we can all benefit from. I was watching all of those, and everybody was writing details about themselves come through. It was so quick, but I was reading that we are all very different stakeholder groups, I think, within education. So, Elena, Megan, either one of you first. What might you recommend for diverse stakeholders of education who have not begun this work at all? Please speak to what you think should be the first steps to, say, a state, district, or school leader, classroom teacher, families, students themselves, researchers. Pick your stakeholder group, pick all of them. We'd like to hear what you think are first steps for people who haven't really begun to think about this. I'll ask you, Megan, to go first. If we're doing the switch.
I was going to pass it on it because it's a hard question for me. So I'm going to pick two. I'm going to say, if you're a classroom educator, here's one way to think about it. And then I'm going to also say, if you're a school leader or someone who might be working at a systems level, put it that way, whether you're a school leader or maybe a district leader. So I think as educators, the thing that you could do immediately is create a routine practice in your classrooms every day where you norm the expectations that anything that's happening in your classroom is connected to kids' lives. And that even the simple act of continually doing that will change the nature of learning for kids. And it's not at the end of the unit, it's not the extension, it's the routine engagement that way. And I think that if you create the conditions where kids are having to think that way, and then you can bring it to, and now we share and talk about it, your classroom culture will change, right? And most of us don't have classroom cultures where kids are talking about their lives outside of school, and it's complicated. It's not an easy thing to do, just to say. I often work with teachers who first think about their own equity issues, and then I say, okay, and now here's what gets complicated. You're mediating powered relationships between learners, and they're bringing all their stuff too, right? And what it means to be a good mediator between children who are also working out all these issues of power and inequality and privilege is really hard. But that is where I would tell educators to start. If I were a school leader or a systems leader, I think I would do something very similar, except for that I would ask educators to routinely think about their relationships with families and what are their assumptions about families, and how is it that you're creating the expectation that there is the relational conditions between educators and school families at schools and families and communities needs to be different. One of a piece of our work is that most schools operate on what we might call a compliance model. Is that the presumption is that families should comply with school policy and practice. And I think that if we could put in motion that the center of our value set is that schools are partners with families and communities to create and raise thriving children. That you could do a different sort of thing, but we have a lot of work to go, right? Like the ways that we talk about attendance and truancy is the beginning of criminalizing families, right? And we have a history of that in the United States, around the relationship between whether it's the school to prison pipeline or the criminalizing of families. There are reasons that, right, that the relationship between child welfare systems and schools are so intimate. And we know that through studies over time, that the reads of families are presumed negligence, and then demands for compliance are the ways to demonstrate good parenting. So I think that recentering and dislodging the idea that the core of a relation is compliance would be the thing that I would work on as a systems leader.
Yeah, this one definitely is a hard one. There's a lot of places that I think you can certainly start. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, really thinking more about where do you really start if, say, you're a school district moving into this space. And this really, I would say, requires some painful, but probably important dialogues to reach some type of consensus with your stakeholders, your community, your educators, to be sure, for example, are we using the same language around equity? Are we understanding what we need to do in order to do this type of work? Are we, for example, what kind of viewpoints should we value? How do we center our system around, say, clear touch points that we all can say, this is what we want to be and this is what we are about? I think some powerful work that's been happening, for example, in New Mexico with some of their capstone work, is what they've done is really started first and foremost with conversations around what do we want our graduates to look like? What does our graduate profile should be? And how do we make this more culturally and linguistically responsive to the types of students that are in our school district? And having those types of conversations to start shaping the ways in which they talk about graduate profiles, the learning experiences, the capstone experiences. So really centering all this work around this particular vision of teaching and learning and common values shared, I think is a nice way to start the work to build some of this trust building as well as common definitions. I just want to, however, acknowledge here that, I think we're in very difficult times. I mean, in the sense that it's not always the case that the community will share values around these pieces. And I want to acknowledge this because, I do actually have a district person that's part of this conversation. And I know this is a very difficult experience for that person. And I want to acknowledge the struggles that this person has had because, for example, this person has really fought for things such as transgender rights and making sure that this is an important area for the entire community to embrace and be and to ensure that the classroom environments are inclusive of and welcoming of those students. But the kind of pushback that this person is experiencing from, say, certain community members in doing this work has been difficult. So oftentimes I think what you do have is a disruptive, but also a difficult situation where sometimes the community may not always be on the same page with you on these incredibly important inclusive values. And what do we do in those situations? I don't have an answer. I think it's really something that many of these folks are struggling with. I just wanted to acknowledge it because it is a struggle that is happening in many different spaces across the country. And it's a heartbreaking struggle, but it's certainly something that all of us in this learning community here would be wise to think about. How do we help our colleagues and our partners to strengthen the work that they're doing so that they don't feel like, I want to leave, I can't continue to fight this system. The community is fighting me because they don't share these same values around equity. So I I just pause there because, I think it's really important for us to also remember that many of these spaces are also areas where we have contested values taking place. And it really is a struggle to continue this good work. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that not all spaces are as easy as others to work through a lot of these ideas, and to think, to move from that, from what Megan was talking about, that compliance, right, to institutional norms, towards this more relational kind of structure that is doing school completely differently than anyone's experienced it, in a lot of places, and certainly where I came from as well. I think that's difficult work to do. There's a lot of work to do to move from those two places. So that follows us to this next question, which you're gonna love. It's a big one. How do you scale the work of making educational spaces or assessment more equitable? How do you do that?
Elena, you get to go first this time.
I just said, I would love to open this up to the broader audience as well, because I just feel like I see all these different names here and their affiliations, and I feel like many of them certainly have a lot more ideas than I do in this space. I think just one thing I think is very clear is that there's no single pathway. There are no silver bullets how you kind of engage in this work of scaling, if you will. I think what we want to be careful about is, are we scaling just to scale, or are we doing this work to do it deeply and to spread it deeply in different ways so that the adaptations are made to fit well with different local contexts? That's really important. And I think that's a key point in terms of seeing good work spread across different locales when you give that flexibility for people to think about, what do we already have? What can we do to then adapt these types of reforms or initiatives in order to improve upon the systems? So I just, going back to all the just conversations we had about going slow, this notion of going slow is so important around this work with, say, spreading an initiative or scaling an initiative. Pooling and leveraging resources for sure is another thing that folks can consider as part of this spreading work. And I think a lot of districts and states, as well as schools, are involved in this work of, like, how do we develop more, say, educative tools, models, resources, so that it's not the case that, for example, a lot of the development work falls on the shoulders of, say, teachers to do, but rather they can be part of the process, or they can look to these models to help kind of build, adapt, and enact these types of, say, more authentic tools within their classroom spaces. So, yeah, I mean, I would also love to, hear from others, because I think many of you have done this work in terms of trying to scale or spread the work that you're doing around these kind of equitable, to create equitable spaces. So, I mean, I would encourage many to just engage in this dialogue, because I think we have a lot to learn from the people who are already here.
If anyone feels brave enough. Maybe you could raise your hand if you'd like to. And Megan, would you take a stab at the question? It's a big one.
I just agree with Elena about this. I mean, I think the paradigm of scale has not served us. And I think we probably need a new policy orientation to what it means to do systems transformation, frankly. I think we're learning that, and I think we've learned as a field that there are some things that you can quickly take to quote scale, but what it looks like. So I'm a complex systems person, and I reason a lot about how do we see complex systems change. And in our projects, we think about rhizomatic change. I'm also a plant nerd. And to think about how do things grow. I think the multiple pathways is the really important answer here. I do think that there's questions about fundamental principles that we want to build systems around. And that part of, while I really appreciate the point about that, like, things are really hard in schools, and that that there is a lot of contentious values happening all over the place. I also think that we have a future to build. Many of you may not know this, but assessment is not the central of my work. I think a lot about what does it mean to live in a changing climate, and what does it mean to responsibly raise children for a world that is rapidly changing. What it looks like to live right now and what it looks like to live in 2070 is different things. And right now we don't have a school system that's preparing people for what the world will look like in 2050 and 2060. It's just not what we're doing right now. At all, particularly in the United States. And so for me, this real question of what are the core principles that we think a system needs in order to serve people well is probably the thing for us to focus on, rather than kind of routinizing a particular thing. I do want to say this, though. This is odd for some of you that know me well. You're probably gonna think this is odd. I sometimes think we needed to do like large scale assessments, routinized assessments, to prove to ourselves that it didn't actually help as much as we thought it would. And just to be honest, I think that, I mean, I can understand, like, in my most generous moment, I can understand how we might have gotten to an assessment system that we thought this would show, frankly, inequalities. Right? And it would give us the evidence around persistent inequalities. I can understand how we might have gotten there over the last 40 years, but it hasn't helped us create an equitable system. At best, it continues to show us persistent inequalities. And so for me, whatever we do has to be beyond the documentation paradigm into like what helps generate new systems.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, organizing ourselves around common principles is important. And that's, I think along with you in that complex systems perspective a lot. And I also think that from that theoretical perspective, there's just, it feels like chaos, right? Like it's hard to know like which levers to pull and where are the affordances within such a system if you think about it from the broad level. But what you've talked about, I think, are some things that you could do within multiple systems to promote, equity on a broader scale. Or I don't even want to say equity; it feels like such a broad word. To give people power over their own education, and to also, I think, move humanity. That you're going to haunt me, I think, with your thought about climate change. That's something I hadn't been thinking about deeply, about how the school system, isn't preparing people for the world that we'll live in. But it's true, right? And you can't say this about all school systems, but certainly I think on the broad scale, I don't see that from my perspectives, right? So these are some big questions about how to move forward, I think. Veronica, would you like to share? You mentioned something in the chat around Chicago Public Schools, but you have a chance to share now.
Thank you, Dustin, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Veronica Galindo. I work with Chicago Public Schools, and what I wrote in the chat is that we're attempting to really get at this at scale question, and how do we do this? And so for the past 4 years, we've been working on the Curriculum Equity Initiative, which is essentially promising that there will be culture responsive, high quality curriculum and all that it is, including assessments, in partnership with a variety of district staff. But what I try to share in the chat is around every part of that process, teachers were part of it, students were part of that process. And even still, like, we're trying to like do better in that regard, to say teachers and students can give us feedback, but also be part of the writing. And so what would it look like to have them be part of the writing of assessment question types, or give feedback on it? And I know one of my colleagues is here, Sasha, And the reason why my team is even here is because of that collaboration with Sasha and her assessment team in Chicago Public Schools. So I think to do it at scale is to, one, believe that it is necessary, and then two, set the structures and the foundations for us to collaborate within the district, but then also involve teachers and students at every step of the way.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. I think, yeah, that's important work that you're doing. And the Chicago Public Schools is not small. It's a big system. So yeah, definitely applaud you on all of those efforts. And I'm really interested to learn a lot more. But we have just 2 more questions. The last question I want to get to, because I think that it'll leave us all with a bright feeling moving forward. But Kay Renee, would you like to take the last question before the last question, the penalty?
Yeah, so I'm thinking deeply about the idea that we have a system that isn't necessarily looking towards the future, and the discussions that we're having, rooted really with academics and practitioners. But this next question is about families and community members. And so we're thinking about change and improvements, but how should families and community members also advocate for change in schools and within systems?
Are we
That's
running
a cold call.
Elena, what do you think? How should
I think it's Megan's turn, right?
And I know we said parents, but I'm really kind of thinking about families as well.
I mean, I actually like what Veronica just said. I feel like I think there's so many avenues here. I think that one of the things that the compliance model sets up, though, is a contentious model of change making. And so one thing that I have worked really hard, a rightful contentious model, by the way. So I just want to be clear about that. I mean, I think that the more that students and families are involved in the change-making process, have seats at the table, is really important. And so I think families and communities can advocate for those structures, right? Again, for me, a system change is not occasional. So I have to tell you, no offense to anybody, but focus groups bug me, because what it is like a gathering of one-time relational, like, tell me some information, and then those of us in power with the possibility of making change will take what you said and go figure it out. And so I think that ongoing improvement work, where families and communities are part of the system and part of that work, is really important. I also would say that for me, that has meant one of the things that I think schools has done is set up families to be in competitive relationships with each other. What we often explain is like the spoke model, where the educator of schools at the center and then all the families are individuals. And you can see it with how, when there's a problem between 2 children, you can start to get some oppositional family things happening, often recreated all the time. And so the other thing that I've said to families, and a lot of the work that we do in communities, is what does it look like for families to be invested in a school and in partnership with educators over time, whether it's your kid's classroom or not. And part of the reason that becomes important is that it actually works quite easily when people stop thinking about only one grade level, or from an individual kid to an individual family. Most families have multiple kids they're connected to, right? And whether it's cousins or, right, like lots of the ways, depends on your school system, but the familial relations often means you can get families to be invested in a systems change more than an individual classroom change than we structure. Exactly, blended families. It's just that we often reason about family and community engagement with, okay, let's reach out to 3rd grade parents. All 3rd grade parents, will you do this? Right? Rather than sort of recognizing, or we go to community leaders who are already in those broader roles, which is fine too. But for us, when we really look at family infrastructure, and again, I would argue COVID showed us this, that lots of families did interesting things around. It was not like just nuclear families figuring it out. It was actually these other structures of extended familial relationships. Mobilizing those familial structures towards systems change and creating space for ongoing improvement is just really important.
I don't feel like I have anything more to really extend on that. I mean, I think there's, going back to something that Megan said, there really is no one pathway here. I mean, there are multiple pathways for how this can be done. And I think a lot of schools that are doing this more effectively have found ways to involve the community and teachers in, say, the activities of the school directly. So it's not just this kind of one-off touch point during, say, a parent-teacher meeting, but they're actually involved with, for example, thinking of ways to provide meaningful capstone experiences for students who are interested in extending their work beyond the school surrounds. I think that's really important to do. And, you know, it's for another, I would say, type of opportunity that's been structured around this is I'm thinking about some of the work that's happening currently in Boulder Valley School District, where they're reaching out intentionally to many school members, to families, to community members who are typically not heard, and having them come in regularly. So again, this is not for just these types of one-off touch points or once a month kind of meetings, but it's to invite them regularly in the spaces to see what's happening in the classrooms and having this more transparent dialogue around what do you see, how do you learn, what are some things that we can do to improve the experiences for your students. And I think those kinds of models are really promising because it opens up the door in terms of transparency of the activities that are happening in the classroom spaces. And it's a wonderful way for also community members to get involved and to understand what's happening in schools. So these are some models that we've seen in different spaces that seem to have, or at least hold promise in bringing in both families as well as community members into the schooling space.
Can I just add, I'm appreciating the chat and what Wendy raised. And I want to say that we know that currently family engagement replicates race and social class paradigms, right? That is what's happened. So 100%. I have another project called the Family Leadership Design Collaborative. And part of what I think is why this matters is that if you can transform that, and then you can start to see other things in motion. And one of the things that we learned that is super important is that if we narrow the space of what families might want to engage in, you can get a systems compliance model in motion really quickly too. And I heard this a little bit before, right? That earlier when we started, what we have learned, we did a study with 10 sites across the country, different district leaders who were trying to transform their family engagement model. And what we learned is if you start a relationship with families that is based in parenting skills or supporting the academic success of your kids, you get far less innovative shifts in systems, right? You facilitate towards compliance. If you start with what would it mean for us to partner to have a thriving community, you get far more expansive things. You still replicate the need for non-dominant families who have not been at the table to really test whether you understand the depth of inequality, right? You get it. And if you're not willing to be in that with families for a while that are, I think, part of what we're talking about, if you don't develop that politicized trust with families, you will not get their brilliance in the same kind of way. So you got to earn that to get families' brilliance. And so I just want to acknowledge that is 100% true. And if you do surface level family engagement, you'll reproduce the same power structures.
Can I just add for a second? I went from teaching elementary school where elementary teachers actually reach out in a much more authentic way to the families and communities. They want contact with parents. They want to know the families. to the much bigger system where I am of secondary schools, where our secondary schools are really huge. And none of this is happening yet. That the parents are something that we kind of push away because we actually don't want the other voice in the classroom. And I'm working with pre-service teachers to say to my secondary ones, you know, this is a good thing. Please reach out in a very authentic and understanding way. But there's nothing in place for them to do it. There's often not even support of the administrative team. So thank you.
It's asking teachers to do 1,000 minutes of work in a minute, I think is what Megan said. And yeah, it's difficult, but I think it also gets to that idea that you need to work relationally with people, not unidirectionally, right? That's in order to bring people into that space, you need to share the space, and the space needs to be different than what you imagined it. And so, last question. This is last couple minutes, and then we'll share something right before we pull off the Zoom call here. But Megan and Elena, imagining possible futures in your mind, what does an equitable, accessible, inclusive, socially just educational and assessment experience look like for students? Answer it in any way that you'd like, and maybe even summarize the things that you said. But this will leave us with, I think, something to think about moving forward. I don't know who's first, but I've enjoyed listening to both of you talk. So who would like to go first?
I love the wait time.
I think Elena gets to go first this time.
Megan, feel free. I'm still processing this one because this is a big piece. I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about is really focused on imagining how this could be enacted, right? And I think everything that's been mentioned here, all the work that Megan has been doing, all the work that, for example, many of you are doing in these spaces to engage in equitable learning experiences, assessment experiences for students. All of these things we're still far from this vision, but I think we're all working towards this. So I think in many ways, I can't really think of the possible future per se. I would love to think about things such as students who are excited to kind of author the stories they want to tell or the goals they want to achieve through the work facilitated by teachers. Thinking more about the role of schools in terms of being community-based, where these are central vital hubs for learning, not just for students, but also for the larger community and parents. I think repurposing, thinking of schools in more expansive terms. And then I'm just gonna maybe go back to a point that we've raised a couple of times in terms of where it's the norm, rather than say the exception, to go through these types of changes in improvement cycles where you allow these types of experimentations, you allow these types of changes to take place, not just incrementally, but through these expanded kind of time horizons. And I think that's really, again, so critical for thinking about the ways in which we take up this difficult work. So, you know, I think those are more kind of certain features that I'd love to see in the possible future. But these are all things that I think would be incredibly powerful to allow for school or schooling to be transformative in ways that are, in essence, allowing students to feel like they are important contributors to the community, as well as to, I would say, just to their own learning as well. So I don't know. I think this, I'm kind of struggling here because I just feel like it's hard for me to think about a specific future, but really more in terms of the features that we're hoping to see that can be enacted more often to build towards a more, I would say, productive educational system.
Yeah, kind of everything that Elena just said. I feel like actually a little bit, I would just say, Dustin, you started to articulate exactly what I would say about this is, can we think about assessment as tools for supporting relations, right? And assessment practices as kind of growth opportunities and good tools to help mediate the relational growth between people, right, in learning environments. I do think, right, that one of the bigger challenges for us is that assessments have been the lever for all kinds of things, and I think it sets up assessments to be transactional and towards the punitive rather than the relational. And I think that we have to think about what are their functions, what do they get used for, and then how do we make sure that happens, right? So if they're relational, we just have some incentive systems that have been hitched onto assessment that are not necessary, right? Sometimes I think that people think assessment, and I appreciated the question about whether my opposition to scale was because it was uniform or is it actual scale that I saw that in the chat. And I think that the use of assessment has to be towards growth and relation. I like continuous improvement. I worry sometimes that it keeps us tied to the presumption of inequitable education systems, right? Rather than what happens if we take seriously the roots of our educational system were not intended for collective equity. They weren't. And as educators, I think sometimes we believe in that, but we also forget that we're operating in a system that has principles that are not the ones that we would choose. As a learning scientist, age segregation, there is no good scientific evidence that age segregation is the best way for children to learn. None. That is an artifact of wartime and the Industrial Revolution. And it might be efficient, but it's not efficient at actually producing good learning. There's just no evidence for learning that that's the right way to do it. And so I think that for all of us, as we continue to think forward about a system, we can't just think about a system of assessment. In fact, I think it's a problem to say that there's one element of our current system. And so I appreciate everyone saying that there's multiple pathways and there's no grand singular answer. And so I do really think that I often, for those of you who know me, are saying that we're a little bit in like a new Deweyan moment. Although moments might mean a decade or 2 decades, but where we really need to reimagine our system of education and what it's for. And we're at an interesting time in the country where the infrastructure rebuilds that is in front of us. I really hope that our best imagination comes forward about what we might mean for school systems for the next 100 years too, or else we're going to keep our big buildings with our age segregated classrooms that now have green technologies in them as the imaginative future. And I just think we could probably do better than that if we freed ourselves a little bit.
Yes to freeing ourselves. Yes, we can do better. Everybody, let's throw up some emojis, some hand claps, all of the things for these amazing, amazing panelists and this amazing discourse. I don't know about y'all, but I feel fired up. I feel fired up. Really quickly, I know it's 12:30 and I know folks have other things that they have to rush off to, but we are so excited to announce that the 2024 NCME Special Conference on Classroom Assessment will be held in Chicago around this time next year. The conference will be co-hosted by the Chicago Public Schools and the Center for Urban Education Leadership at the University of Illinois, Chicago. The Center for Assessment will also be providing strong content support, and the provisional theme is improving classroom assessment at scale, removing systemic obstacles and building systemic support. So we are super, super excited about that coming forth. please do look for the call for proposals coming out in the spring. I'm also going to put in the chat a link that you can keep up with to find out updated information. And we will have the recordings available for both series, for both parts of the webinar series. Thank you so much. Can we please give our panelists another round of applause? I am so blessed. I mean, oh, this is what I needed. I don't know about y'all, but this is what I needed. It's hard doing this work and it's also often isolating. And so hopefully you feel the sense of community. You know, you're not doing it alone, and we have to continue this conversation. So please do stay engaged, and you will be hearing from the NCME Classroom Assessment Committee in the near future. Everyone, thank you so much for coming, and have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.